Connecting. Hello and welcome to today's podcast episode. I have the amazing Kristi McVee with me all the way from WA. I randomly met Kristi on TikTok and reached out and sent her a message, and she so graciously agreed to come onto our podcast because, as you heard in the intro, her message is so vitally important. So thank you, Kristi, so much for coming on our Big Hearted podcast today. Welcome.
Thank you.
Very early over in WA at the moment, so you've got your copy and we're good to go. So everybody heard your intro in the beginning of the podcast, but I'd love for you to share in your own words why it is that you're doing this and why you have such a passion for it.
Yeah, so that intro is a little bit short and doesn't tell the whole story, but basically when I was, my daughter was 9 months old, I saw and I'm going to go into a little bit of how I became a police officer, if that's okay.
Yes.
Yeah, so when my daughter was 9 months old, I was home with her. I was full-time caregiving, and I had her, I think she was sleeping. Yeah, she was sleeping, and I was reading the local paper, and there was this full-page ad, 2 pages actually, asking for women to join the police. And I looked at the ad and I was like intrigued. I was like, oh, I could do that. Now that's a funny thing for me to think because I'm only 5'1", and I'm quite small, quite tiny. And but yeah, I just had this idea in my head. I was like, yeah, I could do that. And I was looking for a change because I'd worked in administration for 10 years before I had my daughter. And I was bored. I was changing jobs all the time. And I thought, that sounds like a really cool idea. So I went and told my husband, and he was like, yeah, okay. And and everyone I told, because I'm like, right, once I commit to something, I let everyone know, because then I can't back down.
Yeah.
So I told everyone around me, and they were like laughing and thinking I was joking. But anyway, fast forward to when she was 2, I got into the WA police, and I started in January of 2010 with a 2-year-old and a fly-in fly-out husband. And yeah, so
Man.
yeah, it was crazy. When I think back about it, I'm like, wow, what was driving me to do that? I have no idea, because all I thought was I wanted to change, and this sounded like a cool job. And I did 6 months in the academy, but my first posting straight out of the academy was to the Pilbara, Karratha in the Pilbara, which is 1,600 kilometers from Perth. And I moved up there with my family, and so it was really interesting. Got a big eye opening when I left the safety of the academy and went out into the big wide world. And straight away I realized that there is so much about the world I didn't know. I was very naive. I wouldn't say I was naive, because I grew up in a like a mixed family, separated family. Had my parents were both alcoholics and and there was some drug addiction and stuff like that. So I wasn't naive to the world and those things, but I was naive to the world of child sexual abuse. It wasn't something that had touched my life. Mm-hmm. But anyway, once I was in Karratha, I actually put my hand up for some extra training, which was to become a specialist child interviewer. And it was specialist training. Yeah. So what a specialist child interviewer does is they are taught how to interview children for the specific purpose of getting evidence for court. Yeah. So the reason for that is because children innately want to please adults, mm-hmm. and will sometimes try to answer questions. If they're asked in a certain way, children might answer a question to please the adult. So the main reason for the way the training works is to get in, ask questions in a way that the child has to answer it in their own words without being led. Mm-hmm. And that is so that a child's evidence is as pure and as pure as possible.
Yeah.
So I went away to this training and came back, and I started interviewing kids as a junior constable. And it was only 1 year in the job by that stage, but I'd already been around and dealt with young people who had been abused, because as a first responder, as a general duties police officer, you go out to jobs when they're called. You know, a parent would call and say, my child's just disclosed to me or just told me that they've been at someone's house and someone's done something. So you turn up and you take the initial report before it's handed off to detectives.
Mm-hmm.
So I learned very quickly about the world that most families, parents don't want to talk about. Most people don't want to talk about child sexual abuse. And I was doing that from the time my daughter was 3. But interestingly, when I did that training, I had my blinkers taken off really quickly about how child sex offenders and abusers work and how they groom children. And I came back from that training, and I had a 3-year-old at that stage, and I was like, right, no one's going near my kid. No one's doing this. No one's doing that. I probably went the other way, but knowing what I knew, I was became very cautious very quickly, and ended up staying in Karratha for up to 4 years, and became a detective from there, and then devoted my time to becoming a child abuse detective and learning and stayed interviewing and stuff like that, because I really was passionate about keeping kids safe. Unfortunately, though, in my position, I wasn't actually able to keep kids safe. I was always coming in after the fact. I was after the abuse had happened, after things had happened. And that's the unfortunate position I was in whilst there. But during all of this, and especially towards the end of my career, I was with the police for 10 years. And I retired as a detective senior constable. I realised that police weren't doing the job of keeping kids safe. They were just coming in and cleaning it up afterwards. They were the ambulance kind of thing at the end. And I realized that if parents knew what I knew after 10 years of speaking to children, speaking to families, part of my job was to interview the children and get their evidence. And in some cases, I would then investigate it, interview the offender and charge the offender. And then I also in some positions, I was also managing child sex offenders once they'd gotten out of jail. So I had so much knowledge, and I just realized that people need to know what I know. Parents need to know what I know. And if they knew what I knew, then they might be doing things a little bit differently with their kids.
Yeah. It's so horrific. And it's so prevalent within our society, but nobody wants to talk about it. We just don't want to address it. And we're all tiptoeing around this particular topic because it's so distressing. For many of us, it never crosses our paths. It's not crossed my path. And I'm completely naive to the way things work until it did cross my path in terms of a friend and an incident that happened that she was able to share with me, which got me into realizing, particularly in family daycare, we're very vulnerable, we're very exposed, and there's things that are in place, but I don't think there's enough in place. And this is where, I found you on TikTok and messaged you because what you were saying was just oh man, yeah, it's exactly that. We address things with a Band-Aid and a fix after it happens, and we put all this money and resources into the things after they happen.
Yeah.
Really, we need to put it at the beginning, and we need to make people aware of the signs to look out for. So what are some of the things that we should be looking out for, or the top 2 or 3 things there's probably a million things you want parents to know, but what's the standout thing that you want parents and educators to be aware of?
You're 100% right. Primary prevention is going to save trauma in kids' lives, parents' lives. I did a stint in the child abuse squad, and I was there investigating institutionalized historical child sexual abuse, and the trauma that went with those people going through what they had gone through with no to little assistance. That was a big eye-opener for me, because if you, in the perfect world, when a child is traumatized by a child sexual abuse, they get support, help, they get counseling and therapy. Their parents are, not affected by other incidences beforehand. They're whole, healthy, happy family members. They get the help, they get the support, and they move on. They can move on. But in most cases, that's not the case. Parents have got their own trauma. The child isn't supported. They're not able to get into counseling therapy. So the few things that I think needs to happen is we need to have the mindset that it's not if it's going to happen, it's when it's going to happen. Because there is always, we're not just dealing with the creepy man, the creepy man in the white van. We're dealing with people, most children are abused in their own home or in a home they know. 90%, and in my opinion, it's actually around 95%. 90% of all children are abused by someone they know. And 30 to 60% of that is by another child. So yeah, the reason why it's such a big difference, 30 to 60, is because that children don't often come forward until later in life, and they can't narrow it down. But they're saying, 30 to 60% of all child sexual abuse is actually by another child. And, and then on top of that, we've got 1 in 3 girls and 1 in 7 boys will be sexually abused by the time they reach 18. Whoa. So they're the stats today. And some of those stats are like 10 years old, but they're still relevant right now. And, so if we're looking at in a family daycare situation, and you've got, maybe 8, I don't know what the numbers are for those situations, but 5 to 8 children, at least one of those children, maybe 2, 4. Yep. Yeah, at least one of those children are potentially abused, or will be being abused, or could be abused. So we've got to remember that primary prevention is the best offense. I wish people would stop thinking about the defense side, where after the fact, which includes, if I was to give a couple of things, I would say, ensuring that that you're teaching protective behaviors education, as part of your curriculum. Protective behaviors, in my opinion, when abusers and and unfortunately I don't like talking about other children as abusers. They're just children, right? And they need that education as well. But children who know their own bodily rights, that they know that they are, no one's allowed to touch their private parts. They're not allowed to touch other people's private parts, that they know that they can go to a safe person, a safe adult when something happens, or if they feel unsafe. They know what it feels like to feel unsafe in their body, butterflies in their tummy, sweaty hands, clammy hands, feeling uncomfortable. That when they know that feeling, and they can verbalize it to someone, I'm not feeling very good, I'm not feeling safe. Yeah. When they can realize that what a safe and unsafe secret are, these are all protective behaviors. And when children know that, and I was teaching these to my daughter from 3 years old, when children know that, they are confident and they know that they can go to someone. And when you know those two things, then you're going to reduce the amount of abuse. I don't know how many fold, but the children I saw being abused and the children I interviewed were the ones who were vulnerable. They didn't have supervision. They weren't confident. They were too young to know, or you're too young to speak up. And, and also, unfortunately, a lot of those kids are kids with intellectual and physical disability. Yeah. So we need to remember that children are vulnerable. Yeah. And we need, as adults, it's our job to protect them. It's not their job to stop abuse. It's our job to stop the abuse. Yeah. Yeah.
And to be aware of it and aware of the possibility. You touched on other children being the abuser. I know in my experience, when my son was in class 3, there was a couple of girls that had a sleepover, and something happened, and I was made aware of it. And straight away, I went and spoke to the teacher. This happened outside of school, but I went and spoke to the teacher, and the teacher's response to me was, that's kind of normal childhood behavior, and
Ooh.
children explore things like that.
Okay.
And it's pretty normal. And I took that as gospel, thinking this person knew what they were talking about. However, after I'm an avid podcast listener and true crime listener, and it's astounding the amount of men that are coming out now and sharing the abuse that they've endured, and a lot of their criminal activity and direction and choice in life stems from that abuse, because the people who are supposed to protect them
Yes.
are often the ones that are abusing them. So they have no trust in authority, and then they have all these terrible life choices, and then they've got so much to unpack and undo. So since listening to all of that sort of stuff and having a different perspective and understanding, I'm like, oh my goodness, no. And this is where family daycare educators sit really differently, because quite often they're working with their own children who grow up to be teenagers and whatnot, and they often will travel through, 3 or 4 years with the children in family daycare, so they become like family.
Yeah.
And there is a very real possibility that educators will let their guard down and have this trust with their own children. And this feels awful to say, and I want to say it rarely happens, but I know there have been cases within family daycare where a teenager has crossed a line. And it's really difficult because they've got these hormones. They don't think, their brains don't work. Like my son's 21, his still doesn't work. But there's just, but family daycare educators need to be really aware they cannot ever let that guard down, and they're in this position to be a safe person.
Yes,
because
100%.
they spend so much time away from their primary caregivers where these things bubble up. This stuff bubbles up at some point, and I bet every child that's been abused has disclosed at some point, but people haven't been listening or aware of it. So,
I was about to say, whilst you're saying all that, it came to mind. So in January or early this year, January, March, the Australian Bureau of Statistics released a stat that said that only 1 in 3 Australian adults will believe a person when they disclose sexual abuse to them. So, and I actually teach this when I go and talk at schools, is perseverance. And so it's recommended that when we're teaching kids about safe adults, should I say, that they should be someone that will that they feel safe with and trust, but someone who will do something about it when they tell them. Because quite often when a child goes to the first person, that person doesn't know what to do with it, will minimize it, justify it, like that teacher did. Oh, that's normal, and like push them away or let them go. And so we actually teach perseverance in protective behaviors now, so that if that person doesn't listen, they go to the next one and the next one until someone does something, because that is what children are having to do. They're having to talk to more than one person before they actually get the result, which, every child, every person I ever dealt with who, had come forward and disclosed their abuse, they didn't want the person who abused them to be in trouble. They wanted it to stop.
Yeah.
And so the reason why they come forward is because they really just want that person to stop doing what they're doing. And there's no vendetta, there's no, spite. There's nothing in that child's head other than, please, I know this is wrong and I don't want them to do it anymore. It doesn't make me feel good. I don't like what they're doing. That's all it comes down to. It's not until you become an adult and you're really angry at the world that you start that spiteful mindset or that anger. And so that was one of the things that came forward. And the other thing, was that child or peer-based abuse. That incident that you're talking about, we would consider that the terminology is harmful sexualized behaviors. So harmful sexualized behaviors are, sexual behavior towards another person without their consent, or even with consent, if it was considered, not age appropriate. I'm trying to think of the terminology they like to use in science, but, so for instance, if you're dealing with a couple of 14-year-olds, and they're both giving consent and they're both, exploring and learning each other, that's not harmful sexualized behaviors. But if you have a 14-year-old and a 9-year-old, and the 14-year-old is engaging in sexualized behaviors towards the 9-year-old, well, that would be a harmful problem, because you've got a power imbalance with the age. You've got them doing something towards the other child that most likely first of all, that child can't consent to, and second of all, is probably something they're not actually wanting to do, but they're going along with that because that's what that's what that power imbalance does. And interestingly, there's a lot of science and a lot of research going around harmful sexualized behaviors at the moment, and most likely, so the age group that is most likely to engage, so do harmful sexualized behaviors, is between 10 and 14 years old. So they're most likely to engage in harmful sexualized behaviors. A couple of reasons: they're going through puberty. There might be some issues, and there's a link between harmful sexualized behaviors and unmet needs in children. And unmet needs in children are, they don't have a supportive family. There might be domestic violence. They might not have love and support at home. So there is a link between unmet needs and harmful sexualized behaviors. The age group of children that are most likely to have harmful sexualized behaviors done to them is 5 to 9 years old.
Wow.
So if you've got teenagers in a house with young kids, and look, I do not say I'm, with all I know, I do not blame or shame or want to put the spotlight on any teenager. I'm not saying teenagers are inherently like that. Yeah. But if you've got a child that, if you've got teenagers, there is an inherent risk.
Yeah.
And if you've got even young kids, if they're being abused or being, a lot of the time, kids will show some sexualized behaviors. So normal type sexualized behaviors are, we know that as children develop, they find their genitals, they'll be interested in their genitals. That's normal. Yeah. Even to the point of showing each other their genitals, that sometimes that is normal at certain age groups, right? What us as educators and teachers to children is, we would say, hey, that's not appropriate at that time. If they continue, you would say, well, if they continue to do it without, don't heed the warning or don't heed the advice, and they continue to do it, well, you'd be wondering why they're still doing it. Is there something going on there? Mm. The other kinds of harmful sexualized behaviors that I've seen is, a child touching another child's genitals. And when they're spoken to and you say, well, hey, that's not appropriate, we don't touch other people's private parts or other people's private parts, and they continue to do it, well, hey, what's going on there?
Yeah.
And the other kinds of things is, young children I've seen in when I was interviewing kids is, they're moaning or making sex sounds, they're simulating sex. Big red flags if a child, especially a young child, anywhere but under 10, is showing those signs.
Yeah.
The other thing is that the average age of a child seeing porn for the first time in Australia is 8 years old now. And that's come down in the last, couple of years, but it used to be 10 and now it's 8. So with the increase of children accidentally seeing porn, because most children aren't looking for pornography. They just happen to stumble across it on their devices.
Or they have a friend that shares.
Yes, they're friends that share, or they're friends that have been shown it by someone who's probably grooming them or something happening like that.
Yeah.
So the increase in that is seeing an increase in sexualized behaviors, an increase in harmful sexualized behaviors, because if children are seeing that and they're seeing that and, trying it on each other. Yeah. So I don't know if I answered any questions, but
No, but there's so much to unpack in all of this, Kristi. Like, there really is, and it's terrifying.
It is, but it's all preventable. It's all preventable to a point.
Absolutely, and like something that you touched on about, when children simulate things, and there's a couple of things I want to mention there. One is when I worked in a preschool in a kindy room with 24 children, there was for a couple of years, it was quite, I wouldn't say frequent, but it was not unusual to see children, and in my experience, it was always girls who would be getting hot and sweaty at rest time because and I always thought it was like, oh, you just discover that and it feels nice and there's a bit of that happens. Is that classified as normal, or is that a red flag?
I would be investigating purely like why, like even 3-year-olds, young kids, if they've got the like the emotional intelligence or the awareness, they can verbalize what's going on for them. I would be like, hey, if it, and it is, I guess there is a point of it that is normal, my daughter will kill me for telling this story, but when I was teaching her protective behaviors, and another part of the protective behaviors education is to ensure that they know the anatomical and correct names for their body, right?
Yes,
because that's so important, because abusers and groomers and predators will use their lack of knowledge against them. And so when I was teaching her the anatomical correct names, we had this massive mirror, and I got this, I think she was 4 by this stage, and I got this idea in my head to, like, she was asking about where she peed from. And I was like, well, there's a mirror, you can have a look. And she realized she had more than one hole.
Right. Some men don't even know that.
And she was like, and when her dad got home that evening, she was like, Dad, come and have a look at my hole. And I was like mortified. I was like, no, we won't be.
No, that's not happening.
We don't show that to anyone. But like that beautiful innocence is actually, and my daughter's been through this, as much as I've gone through this, my daughter went through everything. I tested everything I knew on her. And she has come out the other side at 14, confident, knows consent inside out, knows her bodily rights, doesn't put up with anyone's crap, doesn't tolerate, being treated badly, and I mean, it's a lifelong lesson. These lessons are lifelong. They don't actually stop just because you've taught them once. You need to teach them over and over and over again.
It needs to be embedded.
And also, that consent piece, like, we don't talk about consent. And I recently had a 71-year-old woman email me because she sent me a review of my book, and a 71-year-old grandmother of like 6 kids. And she said to me in her email, it was so long, and she just said, I can't believe how stupid I feel. I've never, ever thought about consent, and that I didn't have to consent to things. And she said, you literally blew my mind away, because I can count on my 2 hands where I haven't consented. And she said, why, I can't believe I didn't know this. I can't believe I didn't consider this. And to be fair to her, I didn't consider this. I was never taught this. I was never spoken to about consent. And yet when I was dealing with teenagers, especially, in a situation where, there was a mandatory report and they came forward and usually it was consensual, there was consensual stuff going on, even to the point where there was one young girl, she was 12 was she 12 or 13? Maybe 13. She had been talking to a boy, and they had been having this sexy chat and had agreed to have sex together in the school toilets at school the next day, right? In theory, that was fine with her, but when it came down to it and she had to actually go through with it, she didn't want to do it. And at the end of the day, they went ahead with it, and she told her friend that she didn't want to do it. So then the friend thought she had been raped, so then told a teacher. Teacher mandatory reported it. And when we came down to it, and when we sat down with the young girl, I just said to her, do you know that you don't have, even if you've consented previous, like even if you consented 5 minutes ago, you can change your mind, and that you don't have to go through with something. And she was like, no, I didn't know that. And we're dealing with young people who are engaging in sexualized behaviors really young, because of the sexualization of our social media, because this is what, it's just, I think the consent piece is missing as well. Protective behaviors, consent education, they go hand in hand together. And then maybe if I was a home daycare, I'd be talking about those two things and continuing that education in place, because consent can be anything. I don't consent to tickle you. I don't want you to tickle me. Or I don't consent, and respecting that no. The thing is that we don't, I wrote this in my book. We don't know that we can say no until someone validates that.
Yes.
It needs to be validated, and it needs to be practiced a lot more than once for kids and parents and adults to actually understand that. I mean, how many of us probably have our boundaries pushed every day, and people keep pushing, right? So if we're teaching our young people those two things, then we're going to have a generation of really amazing, emotionally aware people who are going to respect people's boundaries and not take, and take no as a no. There's probably more I could tell you, but there's so much I could tell you.
I know we could talk about this until the cows come home. I think it's really interesting. I just want to quickly go back, and then we'll circle back to here. You talked about when children simulate things and whatnot, and I come from a Steiner background, so I've done quite a bit of research into that. And one of the things that stands out and always stood out for me is in the teachings that he says what comes in has to come out. And we did a storytelling workshop, and it even goes down to the images that children see in books. If there's these big scary monster troll things, children will take that in, and they can't differentiate between what's made up and what's real. There is this, they're so, what I would say, open to the world, and they don't have these filters. And this is where it's important for educators to be aware that when children make disclosures and they do share things, there is sometimes that line between a story and something that they've put together, but what's real life. But that's not up to us to differentiate and to discern. And I think that's a really important point that we need to, we are mandatory reporters. Anything that comes up that's, like, it's not up to us to make that decision. That goes to someone like you, who would then look at the process and go, oh, I'm sure there are, themes and things, if that's the right word, that you would just pick up straight away that are like, no, or that's a little bit, and you guys are trained in that, not us. And I think that's where a lot of people probably go, I don't know if I should report. That sounded like a bit of a story. But when you understand that everything a child takes in has to come out in some capacity, if they're being exposed to pornography and all that sort of stuff too, that's going to come out in some behavior, because it's what I would say goes against the soul knowledge of the child. So on a level, they completely know that it's wrong and it doesn't feel right. And in order to process it, they have to act it out almost, so to speak. And I could be way off with that, but that's what I believe to be true. And so, those kinds of behaviours, just to finish off what we were talking about before, it's important for educators to understand that. And that's why we have a no screen policy in our service, unless you're looking up, like you found this funky caterpillar outside and you want to have a look at it, jump on YouTube and have a look at it. But other than that, there's a no-go for screens anywhere in our service, purely because so much of what's out there, even when it's designed for children, is really not. I remember watching Drop Dead Fred as a kid going, this is so great. put it on for my kids and I was like, we're not watching this. Like, oh my God, what were my parents thinking letting me watch that? I think we even watched it at the vacation care as kids. Like, it's so not child appropriate. There's so much innuendo and everyone like it goes over their heads. It absolutely does not. And that filters into their being at some point. So it's really, we need to be very conscious of that and very aware of it. And then I forgot what we were going to circle back to. But
I was just going to say about that mandatory reporting piece. Again, like you said, it is not a caregiver's job to discern whether something a child has said is correct or not, or it has happened or not. I interviewed many children who had made a disclosure to someone and it was mandatory reported, or even a parent brought them in and it turned out it was just a story, or it was something that was misinterpreted. But you know what? I loved those cases because it meant that that child actually had been heard, was safe, and that child had someone who cared about them. The cases where, and unfortunately, I used to have kids all the time come to me and they wouldn't disclose anything, but deep down in my knowing, I knew that something was going on. Somewhere along the line that they had disclosed to someone something, and then they came to be interviewed. And I don't know what it's like in the rest of the country, but in Western Australia, when a child's interviewed, I wasn't a police officer. I was an interviewer, and I would look like a normal everyday person in plain clothes. We went to a non-threatening environment. It was in a room with and they are recorded, so there's a camera there, and you explain that all to the child and you tell them all about that. And I had children come to me and I knew they'd been abused, but they wouldn't disclose. And then I would always remind them that they could come back anytime and come and talk to me anytime, because that process is quite scary. Sharing that information is quite scary. Some kids are just like bleh and want to get it off their chest and want to relieve themselves of that stress and that pressure and that anxiety and everything. Some kids are so, depending on what's happened to them, they're not ready to let it go. And during the Royal Commission into Institutionalised Child Sexual Abuse, they worked out that the average length of time between abuse and disclosure is 24 years. Oh. So we've got a lot of people out there with complex trauma from abuse walking around, because the average length of time from abuse to disclosure is 24 years.
Oh, that is horrendous.
Yeah. And so, as caregivers, we have a real massive responsibility to be that safe place, that safe people. And I take it as an honor. Like, it is an honor and a privilege to be in those children's lives. It was an honor and a privilege to have children feel safe to talk to me and share with me what they had been through in complex detail. It was a pleasure. It was an honor. And I still hold my hand on my heart and feel so grateful to those children and to those families, because, their worst days, they were willing to share it with me. And I think that's what people don't realize. We are so quick to judge, to justify it away, or, just push it away like, oh, it doesn't happen. It didn't happen. But if you're in a position of being that safe person to that child, it is your duty to keep them, to listen to them and to keep them safe. And if a child does come to you and discloses, you don't have to get the full details. You don't have to ask 50 questions. The bare bones basic stuff is enough for a mandatory report.
So what talking about that, I really would like to delve deeper into that. What would the questions be like? What are safe sort of questions to ask? Because we get told don't ask leading questions, but we don't get told what we can say. I think that's a massive gap.
Yeah. I'm just trying to think, and bear with me, it's been a few years. I'm out of the job like nearly 3 years now. Yeah. So my brain's just trying to go, what was the questions I asked? So you want to ask open-ended questions.
Yeah.
So that could be, tell me about, so if they've disclosed, little Johnny discloses that someone's hurt his bottom, for instance, you know, you could say, obviously in a, you know, quiet, private place, because you don't, even if they were playing something while you're doing it, you could, and big, make sure you take notes. Make sure even you don't have to write them there and then in that moment, but straight after, because those notes will be used as evidence. But you know, they say you could ask, tell me about what you mean. Tell me about how your bottom got hurt. Tell me about, you know, use that. Tell me what happened when your bottom got hurt, or tell me who hurt your bottom. You know, and then when they open up and say, oh, well, you know, whoever has touched, you know, I had an incident, it's not even funny, but it just reminded me of this story where a little 4-year-old girl said her daddy had hurt her bottom. And in the interview, she disclosed that he had put his penis in her bottom. And but she was able to, it's hard to hear, but it's truth. She had disclosed that he had a special towel and white stuff came out the end of his penis, and she was able to disclose all of that at 4, and she wasn't a quiet 4-year-old. She was bouncing all over the room. She was a very boisterous 4-year-old, but she was able to disclose something that no child should be able to disclose. So, you know, the questions would be open-ended. So tell me about what happened when your bottom got hurt. Tell me about what happened when your bottom got hurt. Tell me about who hurt your bottom. The main thing would be is you don't want to ask much more than that. The fact that they disclose, in this case, the fact that they disclose someone's hurt their bottom and they're able to tell you who did it and how it happened. So, you know, they've put something in their bottom, then that's enough.
Okay.
We don't need to know when it happened, you know, where it happened, or how, you know, who was around. We don't need to know any of that as a daycare worker, as a, you know, at-home daycare. You just need to know that your job as a mandatory reporter is just to go, this happened to this child and this is who did it. Or not even that, this happened to this child. They've disclosed this, that's it.
And would you tell the child that you're going to tell someone else? Because quite often,
depending on the age, well, yes, I would, because that's for the integrity of you and integrity of the space, you know, the safe space that you've got. And, you know, you could say something along the lines of, I'm really glad you told me and you felt safe to tell me. Just so you know, I have to now go and tell some people who are going to do something about that. Or you could say, I'm going to go and tell someone who's going, you know, people are going, not people, just trying to.
I'm going to tell the right people who are going to make sure that that doesn't happen again.
Yeah, exactly like that. Yeah, that something along those lines. But always, you know, some of the biggest complaints I had from those people who were abused as children, and it's historical, was that the person they told, first of all, didn't listen, diminished it, made them feel like, but, you know, thank you so much for telling me that. You know, your heart might be breaking inside and you might be feeling sick to the stomach, but thank you so much for trusting me with that. I really appreciate it. I'm glad that you feel I'm a safe person you can talk to. You know, just so you know, I need to go and tell this to someone else now, because it's really important that we make sure this doesn't happen again.
And not making promises you can't keep either, you know, like.
Yeah, you can't, because, you know, especially depending on the age, you know, especially if they get older and there's been some manipulation and grooming going on, and that person who's abusing them has said, you can't tell anyone. Like you said, everything that goes in has to come out. You know, if there's someone who's done that to that child, they'll be petrified. They'll be petrified about what's going to happen to them. And especially if it's in their own home.
Because it's not safe there, and then they've made it even less safe by dobbing and telling on them. It's such a can.
And just, you know, validating them, validating that what they did was the right thing, validating that, it's important that we make sure that no one does this again.
Yeah.
It's not what happened to you isn't okay. Just small little things that make such a big difference.
Huge. I mean, yeah, and it's that validation, but it's also like children, and this again comes back to my Steiner background. It might be a bit woo-woo for some people, but I truly think that children choose their educators on some level. There's a soul agreement contract there between everybody that's involved in that child's life, right? And if that child does give you the privilege of a disclosure, knowing that you're going to take that further, but telling them that, thank you for sharing, because I need to know that so that I can help you now. One of the things that, and they'll feel that on a soul level, even though they may feel sick from having shared that because they know something bad's going to happen now. On a soul level, you are gifted an opportunity to change something for that child's life. One thing that I often heard when I've listened to the true crime podcast and whatnot, and people are sharing their experiences, is that they have made a disclosure. That person has then gone and told somebody, but it's been not dealt with after that. So is that something that you've experienced? Is that maybe we've moved a little bit beyond that? But I know particularly in institutionalized, it's almost like a racket. The higher up it goes, the worse the abuse gets in terms of what's been uncovered, and people at the top sometimes can often be the worst offenders. So making a disclosure to someone in middle management, they're up, their bosses are already doing it, and so or maybe that person isn't aware, but these people are actually doing it, and that disclosure doesn't go further. What can we do to ensure that our mandatory reporting is actually going to do what it should be doing? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I don't. I know in Western Australia, when you do a mandatory report, it goes to mandatory reporting and then it's sent to police and the Department of Communities or Department of Child Protection, whatever it's called. So it's not like it can get lost, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I'm hoping that's the same in every state. So I would question, if I was reporting a mandatory report, I would question where it's going.
Yeah.
And in actual fact, you should get a copy of that mandatory report, because you go onto the mandatory reporting website and you fill it in, I'm pretty sure. Yeah. So, if you're handing it up to someone, I would question, hey, can you just make sure you give me a copy for my records?
Yeah, okay. Because I know some services or some places have policies where they need to work in conjunction with their service provider.
Yeah.
I think I'll be looking at our policy and just in light of this conversation and just double checking that the educator needs to we make the educator make the mandatory report. I guide them through it and we talk about it, and because it's traumatic, it's awful when somebody it's a trauma for that person to be disclosed to, because they don't see the children like that, and then to know something like it just hurts. It's just yuck. Awful. There's
vicarious trauma.
Yeah, I'm living in it right now with the incident at my husband's work. And it's been astounding the way my brain has coped with that, or rather not coped with it, because I'm a mess and it didn't even happen to me, right? Yes. So this can be experienced by educators when something like this happens on their watch too. Yeah. So our process is that the educator will always talk to us, and then I request them to make the mandatory report, because it's better to come from them. It's rather than secondhand through me, because even a change in words can change a tone. So I think I would encourage services and educators alike that are listening to this to take that on board and to take ownership of that, and work with your service, because there'll be notes that you have to make and files that you have to report and all that sort of thing. But I personally think it's really important for the person who's been disclosed to follow that up themselves and to be the champion in that and ensuring that it goes where it needs to go.
I mean, I would imagine that home daycare providers are so attached, connected. These children become part of their family, right?
Absolutely.
So there is a strong connection there. I would imagine that most of them would want to know that it was being, treated properly, the child was being looked after, all of that stuff. I would highly recommend that whoever is disclosed to goes and gets some, like, either speaks to a social, like a counselor, therapist, and get some help themselves. I recommend that to anyone who has a person in their life going through a traumatic situation, because like you said, you don't have to go through something to feel trauma. You vicariously, you can go through that trauma with them. And I know that my family have felt like that when I was going through, I did end up leaving the job after 10 years because I got PTSD from the years of work that I did. And my only regret with that is that I could have probably dealt with it better when I was in the job and maybe still in the job. But at the same time, I'm like, I wouldn't be doing this. I wouldn't be talking about prevention. So I'm not actually that sad about it. I'm just like, and again, PTSD and vicarious trauma, they're gnarly little beasts. They don't all act the same. They don't all treat, it just can be such a, it's such a burden that you don't really, it's like this invisible burden that just kind of pops up out of nowhere.
Yeah. And
so
even
get some help.
Even like once a disclosure is made, it could be weeks before anything comes out, and you have to work with that child on a weekly basis, deal with the parents, and perhaps the child that it was one of the parents, and you have to face them. Like,
hopefully in most situations, if it's a child being abused in their home, and like I said, 90% of children are abused by someone they know, and most of that is done in their own home. So, if it is a child that's being abused at home, the number one priority is their safety. So, in my experience, if a child was being abused in the home, it was considered priority one, and then, police and the Department of Communities or Department of Child Protection would work together to come up with a safety plan so that child was taken out of that environment until the investigation. So the investigation would be rushed through, because we needed to make sure that child wasn't we needed to first of all substantiate the claim or the disclosure. So we needed to prove that the disclosure had happened, and we needed to make sure that child was safe. But this child's safety was number one. If it's someone known to the child but not in the home, then that reduces the risk and the priority. And then you would, as a detective, as an investigator, we would talk to the family and say, like, we need to keep this child away from this person. So in the meantime, it would slow down the process. It would slow down how quickly we reacted. So if that's the reason why mandatory reports are so important, is because the person who has received that report needs to ensure that top priority is child safety. But in saying that, it's not the caregiver's job to make sure that it's police's job. It's Department of Communities or whoever. It's their job to make that kid safe. It's not your job. And unfortunately, if you're anything like me, you feel you want to keep that kid safe. Like, I just wanted to hug all of those kids and keep them with me. But unfortunately, you have to just remember that you've done your part by speaking up for that child and giving it to the people who need to do their job.
And maintaining your own mental health, like we touched on PTSD and vicarious trauma and that sort of thing. And I've been very vocal in sharing what has occurred to us. This podcast isn't going to come out for a little while, but when the incident happened, we were mid-launch of our course, and I just could not hold that space So for an educator who's had a disclosure to them, they should be aware that they may very well not feel okay for a little while, depending on what the disclosure is and the after effects of that too. They should prepare to feel a little bit discombobulated. That's the only way I could describe how I felt, because you kind of feel like everything's kind of just bubbling around. But to have that, and some services will have access to a employee assistance program, where there are counsellors. Some services won't be able to afford that, but you can always go and get a mental health plan from your GP. You do get a number of free services, psychological assessments or visits that you can have for free. And the study that they've done on prevention of PTSD and the process of trauma, the first 30 days are vitally important.
Wow.
And I can speak this because I'm right in it. And it's so important, because that can be the make or break. And you don't want this to affect the rest of your life. It's going to impact the rest of your life, but you don't want it to affect the rest of your life. So I think we could talk about this all day. What we haven't touched on is your book and how people can get in touch with you and follow you. So can you tell us about your book, where we can get it?
Awesome. So I, after leaving the police, as I said, before I was leaving, I just had this like, I don't know, I was on a mission. I was even going through the PTSD and, and the associated mental illness with it. I was just like, parents need to know what I need to know, what I know. They need to know what I know. So I don't know, I sat down writing a few things, and then over the course of 2 years, it turned into a book. And it's called Operation Kid Safe, A Detective's Guide to Child Abuse Prevention. And the book is everything I know, everything I've experienced, and everything I mentioned that I've got a 14-year-old daughter, and she is a big part of this. She's the reason why I think when I became a mother, it unlocked a next level of my psyche, where I was like, I became this huge protector of children. It unlocked something, and so she's a big part of it. So she's in there. I talk about instant, little things that have happened with her, and with her permission. And so the book's broken up into 4 parts. The first part is about child abuse, intimate child sexual abuse, so by someone known to the child in person. And it talks about protective behaviors in detail and how to talk to kids about this stuff. Then the second part is about peer-based abuse, what it is, how what we need to be educating our children on, and all through the book it's age appropriate. So I give ideas, hints, advice, guidance on when and how to talk to them, and where, at what age. And then the third part is about online usage and device usage, and how to keep your kids safe online in a general base. And the fourth part is, which is really interesting, I think, is what to do if. It talks about what happens in a police investigation, what police evidence they're looking for, and what to do if your child is a victim of child sexual abuse, online grooming, cyberbullying, catfishing, sexual sextortion, which is another big topic at the moment. So it's broken up into 4 parts. So you can get the book, so you can get a signed copy from me, from my website, which is www.cape-au.com. So that you can get a signed copy, or you can get it on Kindle and Amazon. So awesome.
And we'll put the links in the show notes, so that if you're walking around the lake and you're listening to this and you're like, God, I can't write that down, you can come back and have a look in the show notes. We'll put all the information there. We'll put all of Kristi's social media there. Like I said,
follow me on TikTok.
I found her on TikTok. Just this random beautiful blue-eyed lady popped up was talking all these things, and I was like, whoa, that's a serious message, and I need to get in touch with her. So
my handle on TikTok is TikTok Cop.
Oh, that is awesome. That's
Yep.
clever. That is
Yep.
very clever. I do like that. There's so much more we could talk about in terms of this, and my brain has just gone ping, 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 ping with all these other ideas and things that we can certainly explore further down the track. I definitely know that we're going to work together more because I'm so passionate about creating a better world, and we have the opportunity in early childhood education, and I have a bit of an ulterior motive in doing what I do, in that I know the more children that we can impact in the early years and have positive impact and put positive boundaries for these children, and that includes, in your own space as an educator, having boundaries and telling children no is absolutely acceptable, because they need to learn how they can have that within themselves too. But when we have, and filling them up with goodness, truth, beauty, and goodness, and big-hearted care, when we can set that as a framework for children, it literally changes the world. So by the time these little people get to being big people that are running the world and the country, I'm in retirement, and these children that I've had a positive impact on are going to hopefully have a positive impact on my world at the end of my life. So I think it's really important that we take that privilege, and it is an absolute privilege to work with children and listen to them and act accordingly. So you've got such an important message, Kristi, and thank you so much for coming on and sharing with us. I really appreciate it. Yeah. So you won't be the last we hear from you.
Well, I'm keen to keep talking about it. My whole mission, and I mentioned this before the show, my whole mission since leaving the police is to share what I know for the purpose of keeping kids safe. That's all I care about. And the one thing that kept me writing, kept me doing what I was doing, even when I was so scared to share my stories and share my book, because it's like birthing a baby. I tell you, it's one of the most scariest things you can do, is sharing your thoughts and feelings and out in the world in a public setting. It's not about me. Yep. And that's all I kept saying to myself, is it's not about me, it's about kids and keeping kids safe. And that's all I care about. And that's my mission.
Yeah, amazing. And I am here for it, and I will shout it to the rooftops and get it out there as much as I can, because it's so important, and I don't think children need to experience that. So it's such a great message. Thank you so much, Kristi. And if you want to follow her, all her links are in our show notes, and we will be having a lot more to do with Kristi in the very near future. So thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.